When we talk about the postcorneal skeleton, what we are most interested in is the effect that terrestrialization has had on the structure of that part of the skeleton. And if you think about it, when you make the transition from an aquatic environment to a terrestrial one, a lot of things change physiologically and so on, certainly. But the support system for the animal is now fundamentally different. For an aquatic organism, the water actually behaves as part of the skeleton, and the animal is supported on all sides by water. And that's one of the reasons why, for example, whales can be as large as they are. One of the problems that whales have when they beach themselves is simply that they're crushed by their own body mass. They simply can't breathe. They're just too big, their body mass is too great, and they're crushed under their own weight. So that's one of the issues that we have to confront, is this support for the animal. It's being changed from being completely surrounding the animal to a terrestrial animal like an amphibian, like a salamander, that is still supported by the ground, to an animal like a horse or a human where you are supported just at a couple of points. So that is going to be fundamentally different. The other thing, of course, is stability. If you're terrestrial, you have to maintain stability so that you can move, so that you can be upright or in a steady position. The form of locomotion is going to change rather dramatically. In fishes, locomotion is achieved, for the most part, not in all cases, but for the most part, it's achieved by lateral undulation. By the time you get to mammals, it's obviously totally appendicular locomotion. And that even is going to be different in reptiles and mammals and salamanders and things of that sort. Respiration is going to be different in aquatic animals and fishes. Respiration is across the gills. Now, in vertebrates, it's not going to be that way, at least in most adult amphibians. Respiration is going to be across the buccal cavity, across the skin, and or through the lungs. If it involves the lungs, there has to be some way to ventilate the lungs. And that method of ventilation changes dramatically as you go from amphibians up to mammals. And then, of course, there's the issue of desiccation. So something has to happen to prevent loss of water. We won't talk about that so much now. We'll talk about that later on in this semester when we start talking about the urinogenital system. All right, so let's think about an animal, an aquatic animal. What are the things that an aquatic animal has to confront? Well, the same sorts of things that a bird has to confront, or a whale, or for that matter, even a rat or a bunny rabbit, right? And those are pitch, roll, and yaw. So roll is indicated here at the front, right, when the animal rolls over, and what most animals try to do is maintain themselves in an upright posture. So what's going to be used to prevent rolling in the animal, where those are going to be the lateral fins, okay, either the pectoral fins and the pelvic fins. Usually it's going to be these pectoral fins here at the front. In terrestrial animals, it's going to be the appendages. Pitch is going to be keeping the nose up or the nose down, and obviously in us that's pretty straightforward. That's just anterior and posterior limbs. In fishes, that is a little bit more of a problem. And if you look carefully at fishes, you'll notice that they have several kinds of tails. Sometimes the tails are symmetric top to bottom, but oftentimes they're not. Oftentimes this upper part of the tail is going to be much longer than the ventral part of the tail. That's referred to as a heterocercal tail. C-E-R-C-L-E, not C-I-R-C-L-E. So it's a heterocercal tail, and that's designed so when the animal is undergoing lateral undulation, that there is going to be a downward force here at the back end of the animal, which will then bring the front end of the animal up. Now, one of the problems that that fishes have is maintaining their position in the water column, and that's usually achieved through the swim bladder, which is this gaseous sac that runs along the top of the animal here, and which I might note we will talk about later when we're talking about evolution of the lungs, because that is one of the components that is involved in the development of lungs. Some fishes do not have a swim bladder, for example, sharks. So the shark has this issue that it is going to continually sink. And what sharks do is they have heterocircle tails, so by lateral undulation, they're keeping the nose up, and therefore they're keeping closer to the surface rather than sinking to the bottom. The final component is going to be yaw. You've probably been on the freeway driving behind some big truck with a trailer, and you look at it and you realize something's not quite right. The trailer seems to be going down the road slightly sideways. That's referred to as yaw. And the reason for that on the truck is that the rear axles are not properly aligned. If they were, it would be tracking true and be straight as an arrow right behind the cab. In the fish, right, you don't want to swim sideways into the water because that increases drag. So yaw is controlled by the tail, the caudal fin at the end. So the forces here that are operating on the fish are the same forces that are operating on a terrestrial animal, with the exception that here the entire aquatic environment is serving as a support mechanism. When you get to terrestrial animals, that's no longer the case. Now, for most animals, which are quadrupeds, you have this girdle at the back and you have a girdle at the front. And these two girdles are fundamentally different. Let's begin by looking at the pelvic girdle. You already know that there are 3 bones in this girdle, and that's true for all terrestrial vertebrates. There are 3 bones there: the pubis, the ischium, and the ilium. The ilium is the part that you're sitting on right now. The pubis is the part at the very front. And then the ilium, if you were to put your hands on your hips, you would be putting your hands on the ilium. Let's look at this acetabulum right here, this joint where the head of the femur is going to fit in. When that femur goes into that joint, it is locked in place. And the range of motion that you're going to have here is actually pretty limited. Now, you thinking about that, you may think about the difference between men and women, and the fact that women seem to be able to have much greater mobility in their pelvic appendages than do males, and there is a reason for that. The primary reason is this, and that is that in women, the neck of the femur is at a slightly different angle than it is in men. In men, the neck of that femur is a little bit steeper. In women, that femur is just a little bit, the neck of that femur is a little bit shallower. And what that slightly shallower angle on the neck of the femur means is that the shaft of the femur is now farther out, off center. That's the primary reason why women have wider hips than do men. So their pelvic girdle itself is not wider, right? It's simply that the femurs are actually slightly offset. Why would that be? Pretty basic. When a female is near term pregnant, right, she's carrying an extra 50 or 60 pounds of body mass of the baby, plus the amniotic fluid and all of that. That changes the entire kinematics of locomotion. So by having those offset femurs, she is able to maintain stability and walk normally, or as near to normal as possible. If she didn't do that, locomotion would be a much greater challenge. So it's that different angle on the neck of the femur, which then makes it possible for the female to be more easily capable of doing something like the splits or some of those yoga poses that involve this hyperextension of the legs. So that joint right there is a pretty solid joint, and the range of motion in the leg is certainly less than what you get in the humerus. If you think about your upper arm, you can move your upper arm in all kinds of different directions, especially when you're young. If you've ever gone to the rec center on early in the morning when all the gimps are there, and perhaps you see these gimpy little old ladies and gimpy little old men, with their 2.5 pound dumbbells trying to raise the dumbbells above their heads, and how pitiful it is, how incapable they are of getting those dumbbells up above their heads. It's not because they're weaklings. It's not because they're idiots. It's not because they've lived bad lives and never gotten physical activity. The reason they're having so much difficulty is because of this joint right here. This is a very open joint. It's not like a ball and socket that you have right here in the pelvic girdle. Instead, it's this very open joint. The head of that humerus rests inside that glenoid fossa, and it's supported only marginally by the scapula and by the clavicle. That most of that joint is based on ligaments. So the fact that it's ligament is connective tissue. It's primarily cartilage. And as you age, the elasticity of that ligament decreases. So it's going to get harder and harder and stiffer, so that by the time you're one of those 80-year-old little old men or little old ladies, you're going to have very little mobility in that joint. So those people, when they're trying to raise that arm, are fighting against the stiffness in that ligament, something that at your age you don't have to deal with. So it's just something to keep in mind as you ponder the meaning of the cosmos and what it's going to be like when you yourself are lucky enough or unlucky enough to get truly old and gimpy. All right. What we're going to do next is talk about the organization of these appendages, and I'm just very gently going to go over some of this stuff. I really don't want to talk about the evolutionary history of muscles right now and how those muscles are organized. We'll deal with that perhaps a little bit later. Right now, just let me draw your attention to this sort of layout right here. Here we have all of this axial musculature, and this musculature is laid down in segments. Remember when we talked about the 3 hypotheses for the origin of the chordates, I noted that that they all had segmented bodies. Well, here you see those segments. These are referred to as myotomes, and I'll show you what those myotomes look like in just a moment. But these two, this axial musculature is divided into a couple of bundles. So there's this epaxial bundle on the top, and then there's this hypaxial bundle down below. So we have those 2 bundles of muscles, and here's this sort of lateral line going right down the middle of that. But these are the myotomes. All right, we're going to skip all of that. Let's look now at what those myotomes look like. And I want to show you an important feature of all of this. If we look at the chordate precursors to the vertebrates, like Amphioxus, also known as branchiostoma, those myotomes look like this. So here's anterior towards the front. So this hatched part right here, that's what you see on the surface. And this stuff is, part of it here is going forward, part of it here is going back. The cyclostomes, those are the vertebrates that do not have jaws. And you'll notice how simple this configuration is. If you look at what happens, though, as you move to fishes that have much more active lifestyles, that are much more active swimmers, like perch or something like that, notice what happens here. So not only is this design, right, rather than just a V, it's now more like a W. And notice too that now these the deeper parts of this muscle extend both forwards and backwards. That has important implications. In other words, what's happening is these muscles are going across body segments. Okay? Why is that important? Because the only way you're going to get locomotion, lateral undulation, right, is by going across body segments. So in this graph right here, this animal is going across body segments both anteriorly and posteriorly. All right, so here's our little Amphioxus kind of a guy. Here's our cyclostome, our hagfish kind of a guy. They have this very simple kind of myotome organization. Look what happens in perch, right? So now you have those nice W-shaped myotomes with the myotomes going forwards and backwards. Look what happens by the time you get to lizards and the amount of organization that's taking place here. And then finally at what's happening in mammals. So now you have all these muscles going like this, all these muscles going like this, all these muscles going like that, and all these muscles going like that. The system has become more complex as we've gone from Amphioxus all the way to the squirrel or the rat. Okay? What's different? This animal up here is capable of simple undulatory locomotion. This animal here is capable of more complex sorts of locomotion, and this animal here has extreme diversity in the sort of locomotor modes that it's capable of. All right, more in just a bit.